Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the special Board of Directors meeting for May 23rd, 2023. Thank you all for being here today. We have both folks on the Zoom as well as in person, so it's great that you have time to be here, as well as our consultants. Thank you for being here. And we are going to start, though, by doing a Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Chris, would you like to take roll call?
Division 1?
Ricky, yeah, Division 1 is here, and I am participating in this meeting via Zoom. I just had recent major surgery, so I'm not mobile yet.
Division 2?
Here.
Division 3?
Here.
Division 4?
Here.
Division 5?
Here.
Okay, so this is a workshop format for our meeting today, and that means that if you have questions during the course of the meeting, just either raise your hand. If you're in the audience and you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and go to the podium, and then I'll call on you at an appropriate break. And that's fine for questions, comments, however you'd like to contribute. And Jennifer will be facilitating the actual meeting discussion, so we'll go from there. And if you are on Zoom, please start on your phone, and that'll raise your hand for that you'd like to speak, and Jennifer will take care of facilitating that. You can also type a comment into the comment section, and Jennifer will be monitoring that. With that, Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, President Hall. We have our traditional item on the agenda to review the plan for water matrix, and it is pretty much the same as we saw it last time. The only change is that we have made a modification to the last column on the second page of the matrix related to the number of meetings, and that was just to reflect that we have done some combining of the stages for ease and efficiency, so that is now noted, and we're also in progress of modifying the website to reflect those changes. And then with that, as President Hall stated, if anybody at home would like to participate, please raise your hand, or you can also utilize the chat, and I will get to you as soon as there is a little break to get you in. The members of the public, we just ask if you do have a question or comment, we do have to use the podium just so that the folks at home can hear you. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to hear you.
And also state your name if you go to the podium.
Yes, that would be very nice. And with that, we have two presenters today. Yes, ma'am.
I noticed that in the timeline final column, it says now that the date, last meeting date is August 23.
That is I think there was a miscommunication between Greg and I. So the last dates for the supply, we are planning on getting mostly wrapped up by the August timeframe through the summer.
Okay.
We are also looking at right now on doubling up meetings on strategy options so that we do some of that concurrently, because it really does not need to wait towards the end.
Okay.
And then we'll finish the final report and all those items during the early fall time period. So we should be wrapped up this completely document on the shelf by the end of this year. I would like, for the most part, for the modeling and a lot of the strategies to be developed and looked at by the end of summer.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
All right, we have a question. All right, Mr. Wallen, he states the process timeline for all this work has been seriously compressed. It is hard to imagine with only 2 meetings remaining that there will be sufficient time to present findings and have a meaningful for reflection. My eyesight is not very good today. Let me try and make this. Oh, there we go. Meaningful reflection from stakeholders in the public. For example, could you give an update on the status of the water balance assessment using OpenET? I think I aged drastically just since last meeting. I'm having a hard time seeing this. Okay. Let's see. is the expectation of many of us that this is a very accurate means of determining demand, will differ significantly from the duty of NID contracts. NID estimated demand for actual delivery volume and demand estimates based on NID's customer surveys. This assessment will no doubt provide robust dialogue about how best to initiate a bona fide conservation program for NID's raw water deliveries. When can we expect to see this assessment, and what block of time has been set aside for this iterative dialogue? This is just one example of the plan for water issues that will require time for genuine stakeholder and customer feedback. And I think, all right. So that is all built in. We have still been having our stakeholder meetings prior to these meetings to discuss any of the information that's presented at these meetings to allow stakeholders who are more interested to have more input and time to have a conversation. One of the commitments we made at the last stakeholder meeting was to have some more in-depth discussions related to demand. I think that there is a lot of concern, specifically from the NGO community, that NID is going to arbitrarily drive up demands. And so the plan is to essentially present all the model and the factors, and also have them develop the scenarios through the stakeholder group that will be then analyzed through all of the modeling, and that should address a lot of their concerns. But there will be time for dialogue. We have also discussed having more than one meeting so they can dive into the demand a little bit more. But I think once it's presented, I'm hoping a lot of these concerns go away. But, we'll spend as much time as needed.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. And I also do want to note, we've been at this, I don't know if everyone realizes this, we've been at this since November of 2021.
Yes. Yeah.
Right, we're
Yeah.
a year and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I recognize in response to Mr. Wollen's comment that it is a complex process and people do need time to process.
Right.
At the same time, this is a really critical part of the district's planning effort, and we have to keep it moving because there's cascading plans that come from it. So we don't just stop with the plan for water.
Right.
We have another year and a half to 2 years of additional planning on top of that. So I also think that a plan is dynamic. It's not, oh, well, we did a plan cast in concrete, that's it, no more.
No.
So, and we've got a modeling effort that is dynamic, that we invested in that.
Mhm.
And so I think your point is well taken. I also think that we'll play it out and see how it goes.
Yeah, I think that there's also some, maybe not, we probably haven't conveyed it very well with the small nature of the parcels that essentially make up the demand component as it relates to raw water. There aren't a whole lot of crop type changes that are really going to move the needle significantly on our demand numbers. So and we'll get into this more, what we're seeing, kind of what our issue more is going to be, is likely going to be supply issues as it's impacted by climate change or potentially moving forward. So we'll get into that, and I think we can have some robust discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
And we already heard that twice, we think about the ET thing, right?
And we have. It is a difficult concept that we'll keep talking about. But, there is no change that the 10, 20 acre parcel is going to do that is going to move the needle on our raw water usage.
I also think that the board here pumps the brakes as needed.
Right.
I don't think that
Oh, for
anyone
sure.
here is gonna let something go off the rails just to keep a schedule.
Right.
Right, and some of the reasons why we do want to keep the schedule going is because we do have some other items going on with the Administrative Hearing Office related to South Sutter's request for waiver of priority from the state filed water right application petition that we currently have in. And so we're also trying to accommodate some of their concerns while we're doing some of the planning work that we are doing. But rest assured, we're not trying to rush through this. There is no secret, there's no secret agenda to drive up demands.
This process has been about transparent as anything I've seen.
And it'll continue to be so, and I think once we get into modeling of scenarios, it will make a whole lot more sense on how those scenarios will have helped to hedge against these drastic bookends of super high demand or no demand. So, essentially, in a real world, we're not going to plan for Armageddon. We frankly can afford it, or the best case scenario that everything's great and, nothing will change from what we know it to be today.
Right.
All right, so with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to you ladies.
This on? Can I?
Get a mic.
All right, yeah. Don't
Okay.
make me talking without it on. Okay.
My name is Luciana Cunha. I'm a Vice President at West Consultants, and I'm also, I would call a specialist in climate change. That's what I'm going to talk today. You probably remember me from a previous meeting that we had that I also talk about that specific topic. But today we are going to get a little bit more into looking on what that means, right? So some plots, some figures that's going to show what does climate change might impose to the district. And then after that, Megan is going to talk about the unimpaired hydrology. So basically, I'm going to look a little bit into the future, and she's going to look a little bit into the past. And we did it in reverse order. But all good. Okay, can I pass? Oh, here.
We working today? We are.
Perfect. So here, a little bit of the agenda, so an introduction that kind of just puts what I'm talking about into perspective with the whole plan. Again, I'm going to talk about global climate models. We talked about that before, but I will expand on it a little bit more. They'll scale global climate models and why they are necessary, model selection, emission scenarios, and I'm going to, by the end, show a little bit of what we got from those models and next steps. So here is just a schematic of all the different tasks that are involved in this process. So I'm going to focus on the lower part of this schematic, the projected hydrology. So you see there global climate models and then downscale data sets. So this data is going to be used as inputs to surface process and runoff model. From that, we are going to get inflow to the reservoir, so projected unimpaired inflow, and that's going to be used on the reservoir operation. I also want to point out, for the discussion that you guys were having before, that climate change will also affect demand. So increasing temperatures will affect demand. And that might be much more sensitive than, the size of the parcel in itself. Okay, global climate model. So this is a big word. Everybody kind of gets a little bit scared when we start talking about it. But I just want to mention that global climate models are the same models as the numerical forecast or weather forecast models that we use on our day-to-day, right? So you are going to travel next week. You go to your phone app and see what is the forecasted temperature for the place you're going to be. Is it going to be raining or not? So that's the type of model that actually is also used for global climate projections. The difference is that the models for the global climate projections are run for the whole globe. Also, another difference is that because they are run for the whole globe, they are a little bit coarser resolution. So they, due to computational needs, and the person that should hear that just left, but computers are not good enough to make global climate projections at super high resolution, right? So we have to make it a little coarse and then downscale it at a higher resolution for the area that you need the evaluation for. So another thing is that is important to point out is that there is this huge group of international collaboration. So all the researchers that work with these numerical weather models or global climate models, they get together to homogenize the way these projections are created so they can be used by the community. And that's what the intercomparison project is. We are using for this project CMIP 6, which was launched in 2021. So it's the most recent product from CMIP. There have been some products before, and there is some discussion on which ones are best. The general consensus is like, yeah, CMIP 6 is generally better than CMIP 5. However, you should not use all the models because not all the models are good for all the areas. So I'm going to show later that we actually select the models that best represent the weather in California.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Back on, not this last slide, but the one before where you have introduction and the two models. I just found it interesting, the historical approach is what we would have used in the past, most likely. But does the historical model come into your work at all, or do you just go on projected hydrology?
Well, we are working together, right? So they are doing the historical independent of what I'm doing right now, but it's almost like in the end we are going to combine everything.
Okay.
We are going to look at the past all the way to the future. So it goes together by the end.
Yeah, if you look at this particular slide, it shows the interrelationship between the models. So with your question, they both end up feeding into the HEC route.
Okay, okay,
Exactly.
thank you.
Okay, so here is just a picture, and this is global temperature, so it's not really representative of NID, but I just wanted to put it here for general information. So you can see for the past, you see some variability on the temperature there. I don't know if I can use this. I guess I cannot. So the gray kind of show some variability, and the black line is just the median. And then when you look at projected temperatures, and the different colors are different emission scenarios. So we are going to get a little bit more into that later, but basically a very optimistic scenario where a lot of innovation is going to happen and everything is going to change very fast, right? A medium scenario which, does not expect so many change, and a very pessimistic scenario. So this is what the three lines represent there. Another thing that I want to point out is the weather is very, very chaotic, right? So when we run these global climate models, we run it from, here it's showing 1850, but normally we evaluated that then from 1950 to 2100. And you don't expect it to represent each year in the historic period, okay? Because if that was the case, we could say in 6 months, I'm going on vacation and I'm just going to run this model and it's going to tell me what's the temperature in Europe, right? That's not what it is. The weather is very chaotic. We cannot predict the weather 2 weeks ahead, but we can predict the climate. Okay, so we can predict average. We can predict how it changed. So that's why even for the observed period of time, you do see a range of what has been observed, because it's not really predicting what had happened, but it's predicting what could have happened. It's one realization of what could have happened in the past. Okay, so here is to talk about the downscale climate data. On the left, you see the raw output of a global climate model, and you see that it's very coarse. Again, it's really trying to represent this very large-scale process on the globe, the global scale. And on the right, you see a downscale product of the global climate model. So we need to downscale the information to be able to do this type of regional analysis that we are doing here. There are two different data sets, downscale data sets. So you can see on the right and on the left, these are two different data sets. Statistically downscale data sets basically look at the spatial pattern that has happened in the past in order to infer the spatial pattern of the variables in the future. There is a product that has been launched by the university, actually has been sponsored by California Energy Commission and has been produced by UCSD in conjunction with UCLA. They have data from 1950 to 2100, 27 different models, 3 different scenarios, and multiple assembles for each model. So multiple realizations of what could have happened or could happen in the past and in the future. there is another downscale data set that is called dynamically downscale data set. So what that does is to get the weather prediction models, so the high resolution models that are run at a country scale or like regional scale, and use the global climate model as boundary condition for it. And it resolves this numerical weather model in a higher resolution, so that's why it's called downscale, because really it's kind of using the information, it's running a higher resolution model with the information from the coarse resolution model. Theoretically, it's said that it's better just because it's based on a model, higher resolution model. However, it can be pretty biased, while the statistical downscale is not biased. It's actually corrected for any kind of tendencies that the model might have. There is a product that was developed by UCLA, but it's limited. It's from 1980 to 2100. It has only been generated for a limited amount of models and scenarios, and I have been in communication with the author, and it's still under review. Therefore, we decided to go with the statistically downscale. That process of statistically downscaling global climate model has been used across California with CMIP-5 data set. So it's not new. It's used by all the agencies, DWR. It's just that it's a new data set because in this case, it used CMIP-6.
Are there any potential issues with using the statistically downscaled model in that historical statistics may not be representative of future statistics of climate change, or has that been factored in?
It's just,
Yeah, please go to the podium, otherwise people at home can't hear you.
Gus Kelly. I'm curious, for the statistically downscaled, is there an issue where the statistics that are being used are representing the historical statistics and may not represent the future climate change statistics, or have those been factored in to the methodology as well?
yeah, it's factored in. Of course, it would be better not to do that, to do the dynamically one, but they do factor in by looking at month by month, and all they are extracting is the spatial distribution, right? So they are not really getting from the past any other information than spatial distribution itself.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
Can I get your name for the minute?
Gus Kelly.
Okay. Model selection. So I mentioned before, in total, there are like more than 100 models out there from 50 different organizations, and not all these models are good for California. So a group at UCLA and UCSD have gone through the process of evaluating which models are the best for California itself to represent the specific large-scale process and also local climate in California. So they use two ranking criteria. So you can see on the top is the process base, and that basically tries to evaluate how well the models captured large-scale patterns of circulation or very specific features of California climate, like the Santa Ana wind, right? If the models don't capture that well, it means it doesn't capture weather in California. Another example is atmospheric rivers. How well does those models capture this very large-scale process within California? The second ranking method is the local climate, and it basically evaluates how well the models capture temperature and precipitation, both on the mean and on the variation. And here is the result of that study, and it's a little bit hard to see, but try to understand, to look at it as errors, right? So higher the error, worse the model. So closer to zero is a better model, okay? And you can see there is the process-based ranking on the y-axis, the local climate ranking on the x-axis. And we decided to select the models to use for this analysis, the models that are good in both criteria and fit within that red little box there. Okay.
So I know this gets confusing quick.
It's
So,
already-
yeah.
It's already.
okay, so let's back up wherever we need to, so we're following.
So the black dots in the red box are those are the models that are the best for our situation because they're candidates for the dynamic downscaling.
Right, so remember, this is showing you along the y-axis, the process-based ranking, along the x-axis, the local climate ranking. And so the previous slide, and you have your setup like me, you can see what those are. And so they're essentially using that criteria to select the models that are best in both of those categories.
And this means the fact that it's a candidate for dynamical downscale, because that was just another thing that doesn't matter to us, because we are not using dynamical downscale. So basically, the way I look at this plot is all the full black dots or the empty black dots are valid models for our study.
And the dynamic is for
The
diamond.
the diamond is CMIP 5.
Right, okay.
If you extend the line out of the red box, you pick up 4 more lines or 4 more black dots. How come you can't use those?
We can. We just try to use the ones that were best. And actually, we did collect the data for them because there is another important aspect of global climate evaluation, which is you would like to have more models because you want to do the assemble approach, right? You want to look at as many models as you want. So it's a balance, right? Like I want the best models, but I want as many models as I would like to have. And for now, we decide to settle with this until we look at the results and see that we need more.
But you can do both.
But we can extend and do all these models.
Sure.
It's just that some of these models are not actually considered the best, right? So
How do you do the ranking? You run like 50 years through it and then look and see what it predicts?
So I didn't do the ranking, but the way they did it is, so all the time that they generate global climate data, they don't generate just projections. They actually simulate the past data too. So they look at the past data and they evaluate which models model better what has happened.
I see, okay,
So it's based on the past.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, that's helpful to stop and
Okay.
reconnect, make sure we're on track, yeah.
Great. Now it's not working anymore.
Uh-oh.
Oh, yeah, it did. Okay, so this is the mission scenario, right? So we all hear on the news that we need to reduce our emissions, right? So this emission scenario is not created by us. This is, again, a global organization that get together and look at a lot of, innovation data, economical data, policy data, socioeconomic, social data, everything that would involve into changing the emission scenarios into the future. And for this analysis, we just basically selected 3 scenarios, one that is very optimistic, one that is the middle of the road, and one that is the worst case scenario.
And these emission scenarios are global?
Global. So it's really not a process that is local. Like if U.S. is causing the emission or, China, it's going to affect everybody,
Sure.
right? So it's not, it's global.
Yeah, that's important to
Right.
know, is that those climate change models, until it's downscaled, they're specific to the whole world, right? And then downscaling all that data from those different models to something location specific. Okay.
So these are predictions, starting point for 2020,
Yes,
out into the future.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And you can see that there, we have observation in black.
So
For
how do they come up with, are these just, guess what might be happening?
No, it's current emissions based off of the application of different emission reduction policies that could be
Look at what the
implemented.
Chinese government, the American government.
Right,
All the
exactly.
regulations going into effect, and then they use that, but take today's emission
Okay, so-
and project what might be happening.
This might happen because we're doing this.
So optimistic, everybody in the world cleans up their business today.
Exactly.
All the coal mines go away, steel stops, all of that.
Kind of already missed that boat.
And the optimistic is kind of not gonna happen anymore, but, you know, the optimistic is like, let's say tomorrow, we create a totally new technology, you know, that creates energy from, I don't know, you know, from spending no.
100 gigafactories.
Yeah, so it's kind of as it says, optimistic. It's probably not gonna happen, but I think we should still looking at it with the objective of looking at the range, right? If even in the optimistic scenario, we have a tendency to increase temperatures that will affect the district in a bad way, then, you know, it's even happening for the optimistic. What can we do?
Under the optimistic scenario, right, our irrigation season wouldn't have to be longer because it's not going to be hotter longer. We would have just as much snowpack as we do now and not more rain. You know, those are kind of the optimistic areas. So that's why we're looking at the scenarios, like Luciana said, so that we can develop those bookends for our actual modeling scenarios.
But I would say even over the optimistic, there is increasing temperature. So it's, you know,
It's just not as drastic.
just not as strong.
So the CO2 levels, are you just measuring man-made or nature also? I mean, a lot of methane being emitted.
They take that all into consideration when they make this emission scenarios, yeah.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about how you I think you said downsize from the global to a given area? What's the mechanism of doing that?
See, that's when, she's obviously expert, but that's when she was talking about there's two different there's a statistically downscaled model that is currently being used by multiple California agencies. That uses the 27 models and has the 3 scenarios within it, and the multiple ensembles you can run. There is the other one, which is newer and probably a little bit more sophisticated, was that dynamically downscaled model. But we are not using that one because it has limited models and it's still under review.
It's not proven.
It's just not proven yet. If, you know, in maybe 2 or 3 years, we would have used that one, but it's just not quite right yet.
Yeah, and they haven't produced it, because it's so computationally intensive, they haven't produced it for all the models. So it will just limit us even more in the number of models that we can take into consideration.
And if this model becomes the next thing in 3 to 5 years, will our model be able to pivot to it?
Definitely, yeah.
Because remember, it's an input. If you go back to that original, this guy, right? It's an input into the HEC-RES SIM, which gives our actual reservoir operations, which is the controlling factor in driving water for us. Okay.
And there will be new downscale methods, but there will be new projections. You know, this is something that should be updated. You know, as Karen mentioned, right? It's dynamically. It's not make a plan and you're done.
Peter Burns, could you just say a few words about the green dotted line that
Yes.
crosses into nowhere?
Actually, I'm not using that, but I actually don't know what they did with that, to be honest.
That meteor hits and all.
But I'll get back to you on that. I guess it's a line that nobody really pays too much attention.
It's either a large volcano goes off, meteor hits, the aliens are here.
Fusion power.
Yeah.
Yeah, normally, that's not a typical one evaluated, I can tell you that.
Looks like a good one.
Yeah, it looks like a good.
It kind of maybe looks like what happened when everyone was COVID locked down for a long time.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a policy our board's willing to adopt, so.
So that goes back to what you were saying about how there are all these models, but not all are valid or representative of California. So that maybe that would be one that we would not include because of that.
Yeah. And we are getting a pretty realistic range of what's happening, you know, like with getting these 3 scenarios. I would be very uncomfortable going more optimistic than optimistic, right? It sounds a little bit too much. Okay, so we talk about all that, and I want to talk a little bit about next steps. So you basically, what we have done, we downloaded all these data sets, we process it into a common format, which is DSS. You guys don't need to worry about it, but it's basically a way to put it inside of the rainfall runoff model data, which is HMS. And now we are waiting for the HMS calibration to be concluded to run it through HMS, okay? But I didn't want to leave you guys hanging in terms of results. So what we did, we went through and we created some plots and figures to show what those global climate models are telling us in terms of what's going to happen. So here is one example, and this is for precipitation. So when you see LIVNA, this is observed data, okay? So the black line is observed data. The blue line is all the global climate projections. So you see the maximum and the minimum. So that's why you see the shaded areas. And the blue in the middle is just the median. What matters most is, you know, the range of projections you are seeing. And when I look at precipitation, you really don't see much change besides the fact that it's becoming much more variable, right? So you look at the future, as you progress into the future, you see the shaded blue behind increasing, which means that variability is increasing.
This is done by season, by day, month, year?
This is for the year. So water, total precipitation over the year, water year. So it's basically everything that has rain from October 1st to September 30th.
I don't think that we see drastic variation.
No.
It just comes in.
In the average, no. But you see more variability, which means more periods of dry and more periods of wet.
Oh,
And
that was my question. Okay, so the average is remaining the same, but they're
yeah,
they're goofier.
they sit where we don't like them to sit, right?
It's just more and more volatile.
Yes.
Yeah.
If there's somebody's EKG,
That's cause
They'd
the
be
heart
in
attack.
trouble.
Yeah.
yeah. So it's kind of, the analogy is we're getting more in trouble.
Yeah. I told somebody in the beginning that this is kind of depressing, so I apologize for that.
Yeah, around 2080 is a little depressing.
But this also shows you that models aren't perfect, right? When you look at the gray area with the black line, you see that it didn't predict it.
Did predict what happened this year.
Yeah, it gives you the trends, but not the specific, next year it's gonna be 250% of average, right? So,
Yeah, it's generally on trend because it has highs when it has highs and dries when it has dries. That the actual exact timing of it in any given year is likely not accurate, right?
Yeah, and as I said, you don't expect it to be accurate. Like, you don't expect the global climate model to say that a dry year actually happened, you know, in the same time that the historic dry year happened, because you start the global climate model and you let it run 2 weeks from it, there is a lot of stochasticity, which means a lot of chaos that drives it into different directions of what can happen, right? So, for example, you see this large peak, and you say, well, the global climate model didn't predict it, but this might be a 500-year event. And then there is no reason for it to predict, right? By chance, you might have it in a 100 years time series, but not for sure you will have it, you know?
Well, and you have to put it into perspective of just even daily weather modeling, right? Even though it's gotten a lot more sophisticated even over the past 5 years, which it has increased greatly, they're still wrong, even when they're talking about 12 hours away. So we shouldn't have the expectation that our climate model is going to project in 2029, it's going to be a dry year.
Exactly. But in average, the way you evaluate it, does it predict the average right? Does it predict the variability right? Does it predict the phenomenon, like an atmospheric river right? Does it predict like low and high pressures over the ocean right? Like that's the kind of things that we want to make sure that it's
And also remember, we're not planning for a specific year, right? We're planning for the future.
Yeah, that's.
So,
You have a question?
oh, go ahead.
George?
George Olive. In looking further at this chart, what's the data that wasn't collected back in 1923 or whenever the black line starts?
Over the shaded areas, not.
So something started to be collected in 1950, and...
Oh, that's the global climate data.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have observed data going back a little bit further.
Observed data.
Yeah, but
right?
then global climate data starts in 1950.
Here, George, that's the difference with that one chart that had the Pliocene, or what was it labeled, prehistoric data on it?
Oh, paleo data?
Yeah, paleo data.
Yeah.
Paleo.
There you go.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna get to that, but yeah. Okay, so here, again, this is not for the whole year, it's for October, November, and December. And you see very similar behavior where you have much more variability over the time period. In average, not changing much. Okay, now use your glasses, I know. Precipitation on the left, temperature on the right. Okay, so we saw that precipitation is not that bad. You'll see that for specific seasons, you do see some trending, right? But it's not a very strong trend. But when you look at temperature, which is on the right, you see very large trend. Now, this blue area includes both the optimistic, middle of the road, and pessimistic, or worst case scenario. Okay, so even in the optimistic, we are seeing lots of increase in temperature across all the seasons.
Can you explain the key again?
Sorry?
The key, these aren't.
The shaded area.
Oh, the shaded areas. So we have multiple models.
And Livna.
Yeah, so Livna is data, observed data.
Observed data of what?
Okay.
So on the left,
Global observed data.
precipitation.
Just in the Yuba Basin.
Yes. So here I'm only showing
I
Middle
did a
Yuba
suggestion
River.
here. We are not familiar with these terms.
Yeah.
So put a key in here with actual words. We're never gonna remember these.
Okay, that sounds good. So in this map here, you can see in light green what I define as the Middle Yuba. Okay. So what I'm showing on
That's
that.
the watershed within,
Right,
okay.
Yeah.
These are just, I'm a scientist guy, and these are just eye charts. Put an arrow into each field and put a tag with verbiage that we can understand. And we're just looking at eye charts.
Yeah, I think he's specifically talking about
Oh, okay, I thought
next
that,
slide, yeah. So just going through and labeling what the difference is. So the black is observed, the LOCA is the downscaled, and then the blue.
I see what you're saying. Okay, you're talking about the legend. I will definitely do that. I see what
would
you're,
not present this to my own team that works on it.
uh-huh,
Because they wouldn't understand it.
yeah, okay.
So the black line is collected data, precipitation data.
It's, yes, collected observed data in the past.
That's what.
Yes, so that's what I meant before, like Livna, whenever you see Livna, is observed data.
Okay.
Whenever you see the blue shaded, it's projected data. Okay, or global climate data.
The gray, well, I think it's gray shaded.
Yeah, in my screen it's blue, but
Okay.
I guess it can be gray, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And then do you have actual numbers of precipitation? The average, it looks pretty steady, pretty.
Yeah.
are there actual numbers per year?
Per year.
Per year.
On the top, the long plot, I have per year. And I was planning to explain this very through, like.
Words are the best explanation, just put them on the chart.
Okay.
Then we can read them ahead of time.
Okay, that sounds good.
It's getting hotter, and rainfall is getting more volatile.
Yes. Yep, that's
The takeaways.
the takeaway. But, you know, I think there is a large range of audience, and I understand that some audiences would like the takeaways, but other audience might like to look at the plot. So I was trying to kind of accomplish everything here. Maybe it's too much, but that's a good takeaway.
It just needs a key. It just needs a key that's understandable, simple.
All right, we can do the key.
Okay.
So any other questions about the observations related to precipitation or temperature? Let me see if I have any. No comments from the public. Peter?
So we were looking at all the different, the optimistic to the, worst case.
Uh-huh.
So it seems to me that, is this just representing, sort of that median, case?
We are,
or-
in this shaded area, I'm including all the models.
Ah,
All the models, optimistic,
So that's
worst
the
case,
average of
middle of the,
everything.
yeah. So it's kind of, what I'm trying to represent with the shade is all the possibilities of the, what the models are telling us can
complete range
happen.
of
Yeah.
possibilities.
It's the range of possibilities.
We still have a question about the,
Uh-huh.
so I'm sorry,
No, that's great.
on this, you got you got 5 boxes, 4 compressed and 1 long one. Those are all different models for the same watershed.
Same what, so I'm gonna get, yeah, I haven't explained that PowerPoint yet.
Yeah, I think that's what we're missing with the global climate models. And when you go into downscaling, it is taking an ensemble of models to come up with the variety of potential outcomes into the future for your area.
That watershed, you're talking about one watershed.
It's downscaled
Yeah, one
from a
watershed.
geospatial perspective.
So I can back to this slide to explain that, but I haven't fully explained it yet. So, okay, light green is the watershed we are talking about here. We have generated data for all the watersheds, but we are not gonna show all the data here. I just selected one to give us an example.
I appreciate that, yeah.
Yeah, so all that I'm showing here is data for that specific watershed, average across the watershed, okay? So average temperature across the watershed, average precipitation across the watershed. So in this plot here, the top one is for the year, for the water year. So how much water I have seen for each year in terms of precipitation on that basin. What was the average temperature for the year on that basin? Okay. All the other little plots underneath are for different seasons. So the top left is October, November, December, okay?
Oh, indeed. Okay.
January, February, and March, April, May, and June, July, August, September. And I'm gonna defend myself a little bit here because when I do presentations, I don't like presentations with like a full range of text. I want to hear the person explaining it instead of reading.
I
Right.
prefer the audience here.
And I totally agree with that, so I apologize that I didn't know my audience as well, as I should. So I apologize for that. I just used.
We're gonna be going through this data outside of this boardroom, right? So
And the data is all available we can provide the data. And and of course, we are gonna provide a report and all those things, right? But I did a presentation based on what was my preference, and now I know the preference. I will
appreciate that.
do that next time.
Thank you, Ellen.
Okay, so another big plot for us to discuss. Let's see.
Look at all the dots.
Yeah. So, okay, on the y-axis is percentage of average. So if the 100 means the average across time. So average precipitation, okay? On the y-axis is different durations. So if you look at the number one, what it's telling you is how much variability I can have in precipitation over 1 year. So over 1 year, precipitation can be as low as 40% of the average and as high as 200% of the average. That's what it's telling me, okay? So as you go through in time, increase your duration. If I look at 2 years, then my variability decrease a little bit, right? Because I have 2 years. As I look at 3 years, my variability decrease a little more. And as I go through, it keeps decreasing, okay? Climate is normally the general consensus on defining climate is a 30-year period. And that's why you see this going from 1 to 30 years, okay? But if you look at a 30-year period, even over a 30-year period, you can have as much as 80% of your average or as high as 120% of your average, which means that during a 30-year period, you're going to have 20% less water. And that's a big stress in the system.
Can you say that one more time?
Yes.
Yeah, so over a 30-year period, you can have 20% less water than the average. Just because you know that California has this very typical tendency of having dry periods and wet periods and dry. So it's kind of a persistent weather. So very persistently dry, persistently wet. And that's what caused that. That over a long period of time, you have dry weather to the point that you can have 20% less precipitation than in a normal period, or 20% more precipitation than the normal period. Okay, so that's what this plot is trying to tell us. Now, I'm going to go to the legend again, and I know that's going to be a big one. So the LOCA is the projected, LIVNA is the observed, okay? And now we have a third one, which is paleo data. Paleo data, they obtain through analyzing 3 rings. So they look at 3 rings and they can determine how wet or dry the weather has been, even up to at 1126. So the time series of that data starts on 1126, year 1126, okay? So you can see that when we look at global climate data, we do see some variability, but we have short time periods of data, right? We even with global climate data, our period of record is 1950 to 2100, right? So it's not close to a paleo data. But when we look at the paleo data, we see that the variability is larger than the variability of the data sets that we have. So it's just, this plot is just to put it a little bit in perspective.
And what's the location of the paleo data? Global?
No, it's in the Sierras.
Oh, okay.
In this area?
Sierras.
It's tree ring data.
Yeah, 3 ring data from the Sierras. And there are multiple, they have taken that type of data in multiple locations. It's not just one location, but I selected the location that is closest to and similar to the area of interest. Now, I want to point out that this is all for general information and to get us all familiar with global climate models and, you know, projection data and past data. This is not exactly we are not gonna use paleo data into the water plan, okay? This is just.
How good is the science of prediction based on the paleo data, looking into the future?
The paleo data doesn't look into the future, just look into the past. Yes.
It just has a longer time period.
It's just to show how much of data we are missing because we only have certain observations. We don't have observation for as long as a period of record as we would like to have. Okay, one more. Okay, so we are going to run this data out through a rainfall runoff model, right? But here, what we are showing here is a drought indicator. Okay, so a drought indicator combines precipitation and temperature into one indicator that tells us how dry that year is. So if you look at the past, so the black line is based on observed data. So you can see, and let me, I forgot to mention that, -4, so 0 means a normal year. -4 means a very dry year. +4 means a very wet year. Okay, so that's, in terms of the past, we have had pretty dry years, right? But when we run this, and the top plot is for the Middle Yuba River, and the bottom plot is for Bear River, okay? When we run it through these drought indicators, through the projections, so we get the projections, and that's what you can see with the multiple lines, is the different models, global climate models that we are using. Each one of the models is represented by a line there. You can see that we actually get much drier in the future, right? So we are going below -4, which is already extreme dry.
You have a typo in that bottom. You have the year 200, say year 2000.
Oh, it's just that the year sync is on top of it, the 0.
Oh.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, what does PDSI mean?
So that's the drought indicator.
So what does that stand for? Precipitation
It's
data?
Palmer Drought Index,
Okay.
and it's very, it's largely used by agencies and irrigation districts to define triggers and actions for droughts. So it basically measures droughts, the intensity of droughts, right? So once you have a measure of the intensity of drought, you can define your actions, your triggers and actions for a drought contingency plan. And that, again, this is not going to be used on the plan. I just didn't want to leave you guys hanging in terms of, I'm talking about this global climate data, but I'm not, global climate models, but I'm not showing any data on it, right? So I just want to provide some examples of how this data can be used and what this data is telling us.
Pretty instructive chart. I mean, it's quite startling. I mean, it doesn't look so hot. Yeah, I think there was a depression.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
yeah.
helpful, and I'm glad that you're showing it.
The wets are wetter and the dries are drier.
Yeah, and and from a past discussion on climate, they talked about how we had been in this prolonged wet period, and
Yep.
it stays within the margins of pretty much of that +4, -4
Mm-hmm.
during that time period, and then it becomes much more wild.
Right, yeah, if you go out past 2080, that's some fairly significant drought that occurs.
Yeah.
Have you taken this model and gone backwards to see how well it predicted the last 10 years?
Yeah, so that's the process that they have done to select the models. So let me go back here. So you're talking about global climate
I'm
models?
talking about this,
Yes, we have
that you were just on,
the drought indicator.
the drought indicator.
Yeah, we looked at some years to make sure that it makes sense.
And how accurate that?
Well, it does predict drought is negative numbers and wets are positive numbers. But even like, for example, when you want to compare 2 specific years of drought, you know, you have to have the feeling of how much damage that drought caused, right? That was not the scope of this exercise here. So yes, it does predict, 2015 was really dry. It does predict 1997 was extremely wet. So I picked some years, you know, and to the top of my knowledge, they represented very, very well.
Just so you know, David Curzon's been raising his hand a few times.
Oh. David, you can just unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the Palmer Drought Severity Index, that's the PDSI on the vertical axis. That is a very widely used drought indicator across the United States in a number of different applications. And it's literally just a consolidated index of actual observed data. So it's not predicting per se, it's an indicator of how severe a particular drought episode is. What Luciana's done is taking that indicator and move forward in time using the results of the climate models that she shows to see what that index would look like in the future so that we can compare it to what we've experienced in the past. And yeah, the last time we showed these graphs, the air kind of went out of the room. Because we saw that the precipitation, even though that looked optimistic, it's not going to change much, but temperature is a real serious driver in a number of cases. We talked about evapotranspiration issues, how long the irrigation season is, how much demand for irrigation is going to be have to be met. But the other really critical thing is the impact on the rain-snow mix through the winter season. And a higher percentage of your precipitation coming as rain, and you won't have that wonderful snowpack reservoir to get you through the summer in the future like you have had in the past.
An earlier snow melt.
Correct.
Okay, and anyone have any questions before we move up this slide?
So it says precipitation and temperature combined effect. So talk to me a little bit about that. How do you combine the effect of precipitation and temperature?
I'm not able to move the slides. Okay. So basically, I show this plot that, show each one independently. So what the Palmer Index does is basically, it's a very simplified water balance model. So it looks at, you have a column of soil, right? You have how much, a specific amount of water available in that soil, and then you have rain that infiltrates the soil, and you have temperature that removes water from the soil. So it's a very simplified representation of the water balance. That's what it's basically doing.
It's like a stock market index. It's taking into account a whole bunch of things at once. It's giving you a rough idea of what's happening.
So basically, as input to the system, okay, think about a basin as a closed system, okay? So what you have as input is precipitation. What you have as output is evapotranspiration and stream flow, right? So you try to look at this balance. It's a bank account, right? So if you're not putting enough money on your bank account is getting drier. But what is happening, you have much more things getting out of your bank account because you have high temperature, right? So your evapotranspiration is increasing a lot while your precipitation is not changing much. So it's accounting for that balance in the system.
Well, the chart shows, let's take, 2080 versus, I guess, 2020. You see 2020 area, and then you see 2080 and beyond is way below that red line.
Yeah.
So this is saying that in that 2080 period, precipitation is going to be dramatically less combined with increasing air temperature.
It's saying that the increase in temperature is really stressing the system. And even based on this plot here, right, we see that precipitation is actually not changing that much. It's very variable, but it's not changing in the average. What is really changing is the temperature. So in my opinion, what is really stressing the system and why do you see the, like that trend is because you see this trend in temperature. And that means that it's removing more water. You know, summers are getting hotter and evapotranspiration is getting, increasing, right? Soils are getting drier, and it doesn't have time to catch up because precipitation is not increasing. So you're getting the same amount of precipitation, but you're taking a lot of water from the system.
We're in 2021, we've had lower than normal precipitation, but what was really hurting us was less runoff coming from the precipitation because the soil was so dry. So those are the type of things that are.
This model doesn't take that into consideration. So
It does.
says that that model calculates all the precipitation that's available at the time it falls.
It does take into consideration because it has a soil column. So, it gets the, it's.
Key limitation does not account for snow or ice delayed runoff, assumes precipitation is immediately.
Yes, it doesn't count for snow, but it does count for.
That's like a big portion of our storage.
Yes, but what we are looking here is a year prediction, right? So I'm saying I'm adding precipitation into a soil column and removing evapotranspiration. Snow is a type of precipitation.
For the snow melt.
No, I'm not offsetting for snow melt here. I'm not accounting for snow. I'm accounting for soil moisture, which is the
That's one of
2021.
Our biggest concerns though is the.
But this is not gonna be used on the plan. This is just informative. So when we do get this data and apply into the HMS model, which is a physically based model, it's gonna account for snow. Yeah, it does account for snow accumulation and snow melting. So that model is gonna be a daily scale model. This is not a daily scale. So this is a coarse scale, so it's a very simplified model. However, the HMS model is daily scale and accounts for snow accumulation and for snow melting based on observed temperatures.
Yeah, so if I may add, this accounts for the conditions when there's a drought. So you can kind of see what the conditions for a drought is, how dry the soils are, this kind of thing. The RESI model and the HMS model is going to account for the way we can operate based on the existing snow, okay, and the existing snowpack. So this kind of indirectly accounts for the snowpack, but not directly because it's looking at the soil moisture, let's say, in the basin that she was looking at. But overall, for our RESIM simulations and what we're going to do for the plan for water, we are going to account for snow very specifically with the HMS model, and this is why we went through it. And we're going to account for the entire water supply and also the demands that are also being included separately. And we will be able to combine these under the full range of scenarios. And when I'm talking about range of scenarios, those dashed lines that you saw before are called SSP or shared socioeconomic pathways. There's a whole bunch of them. And the ones that are in the straight lines that she mentioned were the ones we're going to use. And they all have a number. So basically, 4.2 was the lowest, 8.5 was the highest. And those other scenarios are ones that are been developed, but are not the standard that people or the scientific community generally uses for applications such as ours that we're doing.
David has his hand raised. Chris, can you just leave him unmuted?
All right, can you hear me?
Go ahead, David. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Oh, go back to the chart with all of the projections on it for the drought index.
I cannot.
There you go. Okay, so this chart is also an example of why we use a whole group of models, many models as opposed to just one. Yeah, I'm sure you're all familiar with watching the Weather Channel during hurricane season, and they have this thing called a spaghetti chart. Well, that kind of defines that cone of uncertainty about the pathway that a hurricane will actually take. And they'll use several different models that they have in their toolkit, and they'll have a line projected out for each one of the models. And it basically kind of goes off in different directions. If that cone of uncertainty is really close and tight, all the models are telling you about the same thing. If it's a really wide cone of uncertainty, some models are going in one direction, a whole bunch of models are going in a completely different direction, and you end up not having a lot of confidence in the overall forecast. Here, you're seeing really good agreement over a large number of models, and that tends to give people a lot of confidence that the models are generally giving you the right trend. And so, especially you look at the Bear River, how consolidated they are, they're all about the same, and they're all trending generally downward through the end of the time period in the projection. A little bit more variation in the middle Yuba, but some of that stuff really starts, you start seeing even in the middle years, instead of waiting to 2080, even when you're looking at 2020-ish, and 2025 and 2030. So over the next 5 or 10 years, you can really start to see some of those numbers or some of those curves drop below that -4 line much more frequently than we've seen in the past. And again, it's the combination of the temperature and the precipitation, with temperature really driving that downward trend of the drought index.
If temperature is the driver, what's the forecast of how many degree increase?
So that's basically this plot here. So you can see, do you really want me to tell you?
Yeah. I mean, I've read where historically the Earth has heated up 8 to 12 degrees Celsius numerous times and then cooled down again.
Yeah.
We need to prepare for it.
Yeah, so let's talk about average, right? So let's look at 2050. The average in 2050 is around 11 Celsius degrees, while for now it's around 8. So we are seeing 3 degrees. 3 degrees.
5 degrees Fahrenheit.
And that's the average, right? So normally when we hear there are numbers out there, 1.5, 2 Celsius. That's a lot. Many times is a global average, right? But some locations might see much more. Some locations might see much less. So that plot here is telling that for the Middle Yuba River, in average, by 2050, we are going to see 3 degrees.
Okay, so in Senegal, they were worried about 2 degrees Celsius increase, and yet they went 4, and it turned a lot of the country, which was farmed, to just barren land.
The climates are different, so I will not make this assumption, jump into that assumption. I think there are many other things that contribute to that, right? There's soil type and other things. So the models will tell us, not in terms of, if we can produce in this land. That's not what we are going to answer, right? We can always produce if we irrigate, but it's going to tell us how much water we are going to have to irrigate. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Dave Curtis again. Can you still hear me? Am I still unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Sometimes these charts are kind of hard to accept that they're headed off in the direction they are. But the fact of the matter is, Mother Nature has been telling us that this has been happening for 50 to 100 years, looking at how vegetation has changed in certain parts of the world, how vegetation, tree ring growth in the Sierra Nevadas, for example, and the higher elevations have been showing a warming for over 100 years. And when you start looking at even shorter term stuff since the 1930s. So these changes are real. Now, it's also true that we've had some very large changes in temperature. If you go back 2,000 and 3,000 years, that's really true. But what we haven't had in that period of time is global industrialization, bottom line. And these emissions that are being talked about, we put enough gunk in the atmosphere, we're causing changes. And that's what these charts are really showing.
All right,
We don't mean to suck all the air out of the room. Sorry.
We still have another section to go into.
Yeah.
You guys ready?
Yes.
We got 45 minutes.
I just want to conclude by saying this was out to show you guys some data here, but in the next step, what we are going to do is put this data into HMS, or the surface runoff model that does account for snow accumulation and melt, and then put that into a reservoir operation and the demand model.
Nice.
Now we are going to go to the non-controversial part of the topic.
My presentation will be a lot less depressing, I promise.
Thank you, Megan.
We already know the answer.
My name is Megan Leyenberger, and I am a senior water resources engineer at HDR. I've been doing work for NID for a long time.
Oh, hit your mic, Megan.
There you go. There we go. My name is Megan Leyenberger. I work for HDR. Okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about what happened in the past, historical unimpaired hydrology. Okay, so we're going to talk about the objectives of what this data set is and the history of unimpaired hydrology development to date, and what we have done with extending the hydrology, the unimpaired hydrology database, and show you some validation against some gauge data for the unimpaired hydrology. So the objectives are to develop unimpaired hydrology representative of historic conditions. And that unimpaired hydrology is going to be input into HEC-RES-SIM. So it needs to be compatible with HEC-RES-SIM, where HEC-RES-SIM needs input hydrology. This is where the unimpaired hydrology is being developed. And these data are going to be used to support the plan for water process. So it's going to be input into the model. The model will be validated against historical conditions. And then once we've shown that the model is working appropriately, then we can take the climate change hydrology data that comes out of the HMS model, and then we're going to run that through the HEC-RES-SIM model. Okay, so around 2010, the first unimpaired hydrology data set was developed for FERC licensing. And so that was developed for watersheds with FERC facilities on them. So not all the watersheds or NID has facilities, but just the FERC facilities. And there were a lot of stakeholders that reviewed that hydrology, and everybody felt comfortable using it for the FERC licensing project. And so that the period record was 76 through 2008. And then jump forward 10 years, the raw water master plan, we took that hydrology and we extended it through 2011, but then we also added a bunch of additional areas of the watershed that were downstream of the FERC licensing facilities. So to include a lot more of the watersheds where NID has facilities. And then 2023, this is the plan for water, and we are expanding the data set again through 2021. And all of these data sets were developed for input into HEC-RES-SIM. So all the pretty colored watersheds on the right, so those are subdivided into 82 total subbasins. And so a subbasin was basically wherever you have a facility, like a dam or a diversion, you would have a subbasin upstream of that. And so we carved up all these bigger subbasins into 82 subbasins, and go into a little more detail on that. But those were basically the watersheds were we developed the unimpaired hydrology for. So for this project, we are extending the original data set was water year 76 through 2011, so we're expanding it through 2021. And we're basically using the same methods, the gauge proration methods that were used for the previous extension that was done in 2020 by HDR. And gauge proration uses or assumes that runoff in any basin is proportional to the sub-basin drainage watershed area and average annual precipitation as an index gauge of unimpaired hydrology somewhere else. So you're taking data, unimpaired hydrology data from one place and transposing it into another place by using a ratio of area and precipitation. So it's an adjustment factor. Is everybody understanding what we're referring to when we refer to unimpaired hydrology? Let's start there. Okay.
I think I'm clear on that, but go ahead and give me
Explain it.
So unimpaired means what is runoff from a watershed area that is not impaired by any facility. So if there was not a dam there, that would be what the flow would be, if there was not a reservoir.
We weren't catching any birds.
Yes.
So, I know we don't have records for 1932. In 1932, my dad walked across the Sacramento River, it didn't get muddy. Salt water came in within 1 mile of the freshwater intake valves for Sacramento. So, that's unimpaired because of pre-Shasta. Also in 1939-ish, the whole Sacramento Valley flooded. So we had extremes going on. But I find the 1932 one really interesting. The Sacramento River dried up.
help connect.
Well, have any unimpaired. We have measured.
We do have gauges. We do have gauges that are unimpaired.
Measured.
Yeah.
But for the most part, we have releases from storage.
Yes. So what we do is we develop unimpaired hydrology, and then we put it into our model where we simulate operations. And then the output of the model we can compare to actual historical gauge data. And we can say the model and the input hydrology are representative of historical conditions, and that the model works and the hydrology is valid.
So the measurements we have go back to 1976, correct?
Correct. Correct.
Dams have been built by then.
Right. So we are using a reference gauge from today
Right.
that is unimpaired. And so we are using data from that gauge to translate the unimpaired hydrology for our 82 sub-basins within our watershed.
And that's going to help us.
It's going to validate our model. Yeah.
What you said, what I heard. What I understood is you have one location where you have unimpaired flow, where you can measure the hydrology there. Then you translate that to the subbasins, the 82 subbasins.
We scale it down by watershed area.
That's the gauge proration.
Yes.
Yeah, got the
And
proration.
average annual precipitation. So we make two adjustments based on area and average annual precipitation. And so then we get unimpaired hydrology for that subbasin
on a daily basis, which is the same resolution as our reference gauge.
Close as we can get.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know that it can rain like heck in Grass Valley, and be dry in Death Valley. A microclimate.
We are limited by the available data we have.
Okay.
But I will show some validation of our unimpaired hydrology to some back-calculated unimpaired hydrology based on gauge data alone at a couple of different locations coming up to show you how well this method works.
Purpose for knowing this, everything's dammed, the flows are with.
Because we are using the unimpaired hydrology to go into our reservoir operations model. So we need to show that this model can represent historical conditions so that we can use it to simulate future conditions.
So that's the purpose.
Yes.
So you're using this data to validate that the model worked if there were no dams here. Backwards.
Well,
And then we're gonna use it to
yeah.
project going forward.
Yeah.
I got it.
Glad you're doing it.
So I'm going to give you an example here of the Middle Yuba River. This is a snapshot of our HECRA sim model, and the big black circle is showing the area of the Middle Yuba River. And so the blue squiggly lines, that's the river, so the Middle Yuba River. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see Jackson Meadows Reservoir. And so the model, and then you've got the red dots. The red dots are in the model computation points, and it's basically mass values. And a red dot with a white halo around it is where we have inflow for our unimpaired hydrology database. So if you look at any one of those red dots, you can see that upstream of that is a black ring. And that is your sub-basin. But where the flow, the unimpaired inflow comes into is at the bottom of that sub-basin. So the inflow, the unimpaired inflow, above that location gets put in at the red dot with white halo. So
You have, historical data, you have historical data on English Meadows. Could you measure then the restoration work we're doing that might increase water flow?
So I don't know where English Meadows is. Can you tell me where that is?
Jackson Meadows.
Yeah, above Jackson Meadows. I mean, we have an unimpaired node that's the inflow, the total inflow to Jackson Meadows Reservoir. I mean, we can take that portion of the inflow.
No, you would have to try to back that out by predicting what we would assume would be the unimpaired hydrology. And then if it was higher than what would be anticipated, that would be a potential area where they have shown an increase to the flow. But depending on that volume, it's often always of the variability within that projection.
Might be doable, but
You
Yeah, it's probably not gonna be
yeah.
real accurate. I'm probably not gonna say it's 200 acre feet. that kind of
You'd
thing.
be
Right.
better off probably relying on estimates based on some type of book value that was done off of a specific study for a meadow restoration.
we've vetted these.
Yeah, there's been studies that have been. So this is how these data are going to be within RepSim.
Kilos are,
Not gauges, unimpaired subbasins. Yes.
so how many gauges?
There are no gauges measuring unimpaired flow in this watershed. Yes, the South Yuba River at Cisco.
upstream of Spalding. Okay, so validation. So what we've done is we have taken the regulated gauges in the middle Yuba River, and using mass balance, we back calculated what the unimpaired hydrology would have been. And then we took our unimpaired hydrology for the sub-basins within the middle Yuba River, and we sunned them all up. Remember, all the little white halos? We added them all up, and then so that's the blue data set in this figure. And the red is the gauge data that we back calculated unimpaired flow. And so we just took those two data on a daily basis and summed them through time, and that's what this figure is showing. So if there was an error or a big bias in one direction, they would diverge, right? You know, it's not going to be perfect all the time, but over a long period, they track very well. Yes, yeah.
What's that he's poking me?
That's a little passive aggressive.
Yeah.
No undefined term.
Okay, so same plot, but over on Canyon Creek at Bowman. And so the NID unimpaired hydrology is blue, and the gauge data that we back calculated unimpaired hydrology is red. And so in this basin, it does pretty well. Where it kind of starts to diverge is in 2017, which was an extremely wet year. And the gauges are rated based on a couple of point measurements at high flows. There are a few of them, and it's not very safe to get out there and measure what the flow is. So a lot of them are extrapolated. So the fact that they start to diverge in a really wet period doesn't bother me so much. I feel like, for the most part, this process is worried about drought. And what we're showing is, in the drier years, these two, you know, our methodology for developing unimpaired hydrology does a really good job.
So, 2013 and 15 they're together right there. Is that very well?
Yes. Yeah.
But still, even if you see how it's starting to deviate, but it's staying the same, right? They're mirroring each other, they just had that space, so it's still
Very closely.
so it's still good information.
Okay, one more of these figures. So this is in the Bear River at Rollins. Blue again is the synthetic unimpaired hydrology, and then the red is reconstructed based on gauge data. So again, it does pretty well. And this is from 1976 through 2014. And this is just the natural flow, because a lot of water is imported into the Bear River. So this is just the natural watershed runoff.
So, I'm glad you said that. So, during that time, how much water did we sell? So, I mean, how much was imported and how much? Because we're only looking at about 150,000, 155,000 acre feet a year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. Not even less than that.
No, we don't.
But, I mean, the point is that a lot of water is imported. A lot of this water goes to South Sutter,
Oh, from the Yuba to the Bear?
well, from Bear Sutter. Or to the South Sutter, right?
Well, yeah, they have water rights off the Bear.
Right.
Well, it's complicated.
Yeah, I didn't expect an answer, I just wanted to.
Because them,
the Bear River.
Well, it gets complicated, and then you also have PG&E water in Rollins,
well,
so,
then you have abandonment of water, which then
Right.
becomes available for appropriation, so it gets a little wonky.
So is this the total water flow in the Bear River, or this is NID?
this is the total
Total.
unimpaired.
So this,
Unimpaired. We do model PG&E water through the system versus NID water through the system, but that is a whole new complicated discussion. Yeah. That's just misread blue model.
This is just the bucket,
Yeah,
the total bucket of.
this is total bucket, what
Not
my
portion of who's, just all of it, yeah, that runs off.
Everybody shares.
Well, when people, PG&E abandons water and we pick it up. And then we store some of their water. Depending on the time of the year, that amount fluctuates.
One goes to Camp Far West.
Yeah, they have their own water rights.
Yep.
And they're lowest, right?
Or spills.
And we have spills. And you have to remember,
Very
Rollins
early.
starts spilling really early every single year, just about. It's rare Rollins doesn't spill.
This is the first time I've seen a amount of water over a certain
Yeah, that's
period of time, and thanks for showing us that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's significant.
Yeah, the unimpaired hydrology is not taking into account any storage limitations you might have. Right, that's when spilling starts coming in.
Okay, so next step. So we've developed this unimpaired hydrology data set for all these 82 subbasins, and we're gonna put that data into the HEC-RES-SIM model. So we're gonna then run the RES-SIM model, and we're going to regulate that unimpaired hydrology. The unregulated, we're gonna regulate it. And so the model is going to mimic how historically NID operates, how PG&E operates. And we can look at the historical gauge records and look at the model output, and we can compare the two and say, oh, this is working. This is good. And then, once we have confidence in our model, then we can take the climate change hydrology that's going to come out of HMS, and we're going to put that into the RES-SIM model. And then we're going to look at what happens into the future. Got to be confident with the past before you can look at the future.
And understand the rules under which we're operating, right? So we have rules by which we have to operate the reservoirs currently based on a variety of permits. Then we'll have future rules based off of our new FERC license. And so all those have become inputs into the model.
when you do that looking forward, since it's not done, are you doing like worst case, best case, likely case?
Well, we already have, for the most part, we already have the in-stream flow requirements that are associated with the proposed FERC relicensing pretty much dialed in. There are a couple of loose outliers related to some additional information responses that we have been working on that have to do with temperatures in the lower Yuba, as well as there are also some ongoing water right protests related to a water right cleanup that was initiated some time ago that could also potentially have some in-stream flow requirements which are not set. Then there's voluntary agreements. So it's all a prediction. There's also just the concept of having an unimpaired flow standard applied to us, whether through regulatory action, emergency action, formal certification, a variety of ways. All of those would impact our operation of the reservoirs, shortages, when we have water, when we don't. So moving forward, that's why, we keep saying we have to continuously update the model.
Will we see those variables listed as risks, the ones that aren't bound by something?
Yeah, and those also can go into the scenarios, right? So we can say one scenario is that, we become under an unimpaired flow regime, and that could be a model scenario.
Today they came out with the Colorado in 3 states. So they're giving up water, they're gonna be out looking for water.
Selling water?
Here in the purchase it,
Well, that's not the subject, huge political swings or major changes in water rights into the future. I mean, there's always legislation. There's 3 bills going through right now that are referencing the current water rights system, whether it's from the priority system or even from curtailment. It's hard, we're not gonna model every new bill that comes forward. We just simply can't do that.
But we'll have the ability as we move forward, right? That would just be another demand on us, that we could then input into it and get information, right? So if we thought that was gonna be a concern, we could run that scenario to say, yeah, we gotta get rid of that 50% pass.
Yeah, 50% pass or curtailment. Yeah, we're starting to see curtailments come quicker and last longer and not be lifted based off of seniority. Those are things that we can model. We can't start diverting until later in the year.
We need all this information, because then we combine it with the demand, shows you the supply component, right? How much water is actually available, when it's available, what our demands are, and how much we have to be able to meet that or not meet it.
this is
All
great,
coming together.
thank you.
So, any questions? Let's see if any, Peter, please.
I just have, could you just, explain the stage of, solving, does such a great job of making what you say down, their comment on the.
Yeah, no, we use a mix of unimpaired gauges. So the South Yuba at Cisco was not used for the Bear River at all. Yeah. So that was just everything that had a snowmelt component to it. That's what we used for those subbasins.
How many unimpaired gauges are there?
There are a few that are in the lower section. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
So it's representative of the similar area.
Exactly.
And then it's,
Exactly.
yeah.
We look at elevations and make sure that the reference gauges that we're using have runoff that are represented within those elevation areas so that we can get similar precipitation runoff versus snow runoff. Yeah. Yeah. Because if I had used Cisco to generate unimpaired hydrology in the Bear River, those 2 lines would not have tracked very well. Yeah, good point.
If anyone from home has any questions. Not seeing anyone in the chat. All right, anyone else? George?
Georgia, with apologies, I have a question about the matrix. Can I ask it, or can I ask you off?
Either, is it a long question? Do we need a chat?
I hope not. I think it's straightforward. I didn't understand your answer to Otis's question at the outset. I'm wondering about the August 2023 apparent endpoint for these meetings to make decisions about the plan for water. And I'm hoping that that is not a true endpoint. I think that's what you said, but I want to double check.
Right, so the meetings will last longer. The August 2023 is really to get through basically this big modeling effort. So, but in August, September, we should have quite a few of the results to be able to have some of the larger discussions. But at the same time, like I said, I want to start double booking meetings so we can start the strategies conversation prior to that ending.
Yeah.
I anticipate everything wrapping up, but before the end of the year. Report everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yep. So we've been out this since, yeah, November 2021. So I think that people are getting nervous because we're getting to the end, but I think, I think there is some expectation that we're gonna have this one-size-fits-all answer for what the future holds, which isn't necessarily the case. And that is why we're also building this to have a variety of scenarios to achieve kind of that comfort level, like on, you know, as it was presented with the climate change, you know, what's the most optimistic thing, what's the worst thing that's gonna happen? And then likely, you know, if I read the tea leaves right, we probably plan for somewhere more reasonable in the middle.
Thank you. I get that, you talked about people being nervous, and Circle is nervous about the complexity of the demand portion of this.
I think, yeah, there's been a lot of conversation related to individual per parcel water use.
Yeah.
And I think what you're starting to see here, which will become more and more apparent, is on a per parcel basis, not driving demand. That is not, it's what our demands are more going to be driven off of a lot of the conversations that we had tonight about climate change. Because I know a lot of the concern was is, how are you gonna use, crop types? How does that change? How much water do they change? We'll talk about those things, but that's not really gonna be moving the needle. But you'll be able to see that when we start running the scenarios.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. But I do think the gentleman is back. He had a question. You came up to the podium and we ignored you.
I got it.
Okay, good. Well, that's easy. It's the kind of student we like right there. All right.
Okay, well, thank you all for participating today. Thank you so much to our consultants who have worked so hard to, help explain and do all the data analysis. It's obviously a huge lift and we thank you very much. And that, we will say adios.